Thank you, Milton. Okay, great. Okay, so I wanted to start with this slide, which many of you may be aware of. Let's see. Great. And on the left, you see the U.S. life expectancy at time of birth since the 1900s. And we've actually done pretty well. The average life expectancy is growing to about the age of 80, a little higher if you're female, a little lower if you're male. And we had a dip between the years of 1915 to around 1918, and that was explained by both World War I and the influenza epidemic. But for the first time, really, since the 1900s, we've had a 3-year fall in life expectancy, and so that's what the chart on the right shows. And so since 2014 to 2017, and probably as we get data for 2018, we'll see, unfortunately, a decline in U.S. life expectancy. So, we at Human Longevity are interested not only in increasing the lifespan, but also increasing, more importantly, the healthy human lifespan. And we're focused largely on multimodal integrated data and AI as a way of driving decision support to get to that end goal. And we believe that the next big shift, the next set of tools that will enable us to extend the healthy human lifespan is largely going to be multimodal machine learning-based analytics and diagnostics. And I hope in my 10-minute talk today that I'll be able to convey how we think this is actually going to happen. But I would just throw out there for all of you that I know there's been a lot of hype and hyperbole around AI, right? You go to any healthcare conference, JP Morgan included, everyone's talking about how AI reduced to clinical practice is going to change the face of medicine. That largely hasn't happened. And so I hope also today I'll be able to convey how we think that reduced to practice that this will be the case. But I will throw out there that, I think largely one of the failures in our ability to use AI to drive decision support and increase the healthy human lifespan has been historically our inability to collect deep, meaningful data to drive that decision support. And so let me talk a little bit about that. We invest as a country, and this is probably no surprise to any of you in the room, $3 trillion into our healthcare system. 98% of that is spent on the back end, not the front end, on the kind of reactive treatment side. Only 2% goes to prevention, and it's 17% of our GDP and growing. And I would argue that what we get for that is largely still sick care. If you think about, this is an example of bladder cancer. I'm a radiologist by training, physician scientist. We see this all the time, unfortunately, with many solid organ tumors. The way that most cancer, unfortunately, is detected today is after it presents with symptoms. So in the case of bladder cancer, we call it hematuria, or blood in the urine. You can see on that left image over there, a large bladder mass causing dilation of the ureter entering the bladder. And this is unfortunately the typical case for most cancers. So this presents with blood in the urine. There's probably metastatic lymph nodes, and this may not end very well. In the middle, I would argue, is sort of WellCare 1.0, where we're headed, which is pre-symptomatic diagnosis, which is using deep data, your deep data, genomics, imaging, blood biomarkers. We can diagnose your disease at stage 1 when it's early enough to do something about it. But the reality is that you still got the disease in the first place. And I think where we're moving with AI, and the promise of AI, is that based on your risk factors, your imaging, genetic, blood biomarkers, we can tell you about your risk for chronic age-related disease 10 or 20 years before disease onset. We can talk to you about your personalized, modifiable risk factors, and that if you do X, Y, and Z, you'll never get the disease in the first place. And I think that's the promise of AI. Now, we at Human Longevity have a health intelligence platform that is centered around prevention using AI and deep diagnostics. And some would say it's expensive, but my argument is if you think well care is expensive, the alternative is way more expensive, and that's sick care. Because treating metastatic bladder cancer is much more expensive than treating stage 1 bladder cancer, is much more expensive than getting your genomic and imaging data, predicting your risk, and asking you to do something about it before you get the disease in the first place. So, what we call our health nucleus is really a precision health space that provides the data-driven precision health platform that now 5,000 patients and clients have come through to be assessed. But it started largely as a science experiment. So Craig Venter, who had a hand in sequencing the human genome, as a co-founder of our company, we set up really what was 3 years ago a science experiment. And in the first level of our corporate headquarters, we set up a data collection laboratory, and the whole idea was to explore the normal human variation in phenotype as a better way of understanding genotype. So we recruited 50 presumed healthy individuals under IRB, fully informed research consent, and these individuals underwent whole genome sequencing and whole body imaging and CT calcium scoring and microbiome and 4D echo and every deep quantitative test that you could imagine. And what we learned was that these presumed healthy 50 individuals weren't so healthy after all. And in fact, 1 in 50 had a new high-grade tumor, most of them early stage, that wasn't previously known. 1 in 50 with a brain or aortic aneurysm not previously known. Roughly 1 in 10 with advanced coronary artery disease that wasn't previously known. 30% with prediabetes, metabolic syndrome, elevated liver fat, elevated visceral adipose tissue. 86% were carriers for autosomal recessive disease when we looked across their genome. And more importantly, 1 in 5, 20%, had a rare genetic mutation, a rare monogenic variant like a BRCA mutation, which predisposes women to breast and ovarian cancer and men to prostate cancer. 1 in 5. And these are some, I'm a radiologist, so I'm obligated to show you some whole body MRI images. And actually, it's interesting. These are images, we think of chronic age-related disease, of cancer, as affecting folks in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, but I'm showing you some cases of men and women, patients in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. So chronic age-related disease doesn't necessarily just strike in the 50s and 60s and later decades. These are instances of disease at much earlier ages. 2 women in their 30s with high-grade papillary thyroid cancer. She was treated with a hemithyroidectomy. This was early stage. A 54-year-old with no risk factors for lung cancer, non-smoker, 2-centimeter adenocarcinoma that was resected a week later, lymph node negative, stage 1. And it's not just tumors, so brain aneurysms. This was a grape-sized aneurysm that was coiled a week later. Unfortunately, the way that these usually present is a fatal brain bleed, subarachnoid hemorrhage, which is often associated with significant morbidity and mortality. So this one was caught earlier with our non-contrast imaging. Advanced coronary artery disease, 17% of the patients that we've seen in their 30s and 40s have calcified plaque in their coronaries, 17%, all of it sort of unsuspecting. This was a 45-year-old, again, presumed healthy female. She also had a genetic mutation in the LDL receptor, cholesterol receptor, which explains in part why she has significant coronary artery disease and what you'd expect in a 70 or 80-year-old. And the overall takeaway from the now 5,000 clients that we've had through our assessment in La Jolla is that 14% have clinically significant life-altering findings and 40% have clinically significant findings. So that 14% are early-stage high-grade tumors, aneurysms, BRCA mutations, and so forth. Now, we like to say, at Human Longevity and in the health nucleus that we are truly measuring what matters. And probably all of you in the room are using deep quantitative data to drive decision support in nearly every aspect of your lives, right? Investment decisions, your car has hundreds of sensors. If you have a startup company, here in Silicon Valley, you read Measure What Matters, John Doerr's book, and you use objective and key results, OKRs, to measure productivity. Why are we not using the same deep quantitative measuring what matters, know your numbers approach to precision health and wellness primary care. We should be. And we can argue kind of about the fountain of youth, reality, or overhyped promise. But regardless, we feel that longevity and high performance really starts with a fountain of data, fountain of your data. And so our assessment, this data-driven precision health assessment, is really geared toward answering two questions. What is my condition now? And importantly, what is my risk for chronic age-related disease in the future, in a year from now, in 5 years from now, in 10 years from now? Because thankfully, most of the folks who come through our assessment, if you were to come through our assessment, you won't have a tumor or an aneurysm or a rare monogenic genetic mutation. But importantly, we'll be able to collect 100 gigabytes of data on you, growing to a terabyte, by the way, and we'll be able to tell you, based on your biomarkers, your personalized risk factors, what is your actual annualized incidence rate of getting Alzheimer's, coronary artery disease, diabetes a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And importantly, if that risk is elevated, what's the number one or number two personalized risk factor that I can modify to mitigate that risk? And when I give talks about what we do, I'll often kind of poll the audience. If I ask you, what is the number one disease or condition that's going to get in the way of you living to the age of 100, you probably couldn't tell me. And worse yet, your doctor probably couldn't tell you or tell me. And I actually think we have it in our power for you to know what is that number one disease or condition. We're just not we historically have not been testing deep enough for you to know that. So this is an example of AI reduced to clinical practice. Again, thankfully, most of the folks that come to see us don't have a tumor, don't have an aneurysm, but everyone benefits from an assessment of the risk for chronic age-related disease. When I socialize whole body imaging, the first thing that most folks think about is whole body CT or screening. Actually, the primary purpose of the whole body imaging, again, it's MR-based, there's no radiation, there's no IV contrast, is to collect imaging biomarkers, personalized measurements, quantitative measurements of ejection fraction, visceral fat, muscle mass, intramuscular fat, liver fat, mesial temporal lobe atrophy in the brain, or hopefully lack thereof. And we can integrate these data with genomic information and blood biomarkers, again, to give you a readout, in this case, of prediabetes metabolic syndrome, which is a readout on your propensity for longevity, but also high performance. Because if you have elevated liver fat or visceral adipose tissue, not only is it contributing to your risk for metabolic syndrome and decreased longevity, but it's also affecting your performance today. And this is really kind of the holy grail of our platform. And this is actually a personalized risk assessment, 8-year pre-symptomatic risk assessment, personalized for dementia. And we actually started with this because we got a lot of early feedback from our patients and clients that, hey, I don't want to know my risk for dementia because there's nothing you can do about it. And actually, we know that a third of the risk for dementia and mild cognitive impairment is modifiable. For diabetes and metabolic syndrome, it's close to 80% modifiable in your control. So 30% for dementia. So it's one thing, right, if you already have lost part of your mesial temporal lobe, your hippocampus, to Alzheimer's, we can't currently regrow neurons, right? But if I can tell you about your risk 10 years before disease onset, I can tell you what your number one modifiable risk factor is. That's a whole nother story. So that's exactly what we do with dementia for our clients who come in over the age of 55. Based on their imaging biomarkers, measurements of mesial temporal lobe and the hippocampus, rare and common variants from genetics and blood biomarkers like cholesterol, we can create a plot really of your 8-year pre-symptomatic risk, your annualized incidence of converting to mild cognitive impairment or dementia if you don't already have the disease. And this is not relative risk or population level risk, but based on all that we know about you, your actual risk and what the number one personalized modifiable risk factor is. And so, I like to say, if you tell someone, in their 60s or 70s, hey, lose weight and lower your cholesterol, it'll kind of be met with mind your own business, right? But if I can show that same individual that they have elevated risk for mild cognitive impairment or dementia, and that their number one personalized modifiable risk factor is lowering their cholesterol or lowering their BMI, and I think that becomes a very different conversation. And so this is, just citing a number of investigators in this space. There's a number of publications. Recently, this one was in Lancet Commissions a couple of years ago. We know, in fact, that a third of the risk for dementia, actually some neurologists and scientists in this space even advocate that closer to 40 or 50% of the risk for dementia is due to modifiable risk factors. So knowing your risk ahead of time becomes super important. So our platform is really a solution to this problem, and this is not just a US problem, but these are US stats. It's a global problem, unfortunately, which is that a third of us living to the age of 50 won't make it to the age of 75 due to premature morbidity and mortality from preventable chronic age-related disease. And it's mostly cardiovascular disease and cancer, but a number of others as well. And by the way, this is what we get for our investment, right? Our $3 trillion and 17% of GDP, this is what we're getting. So it reads kind of like an indictment of our current healthcare system. This is largely what we've been doing to drive decision support for health and wellness and primary care on the left, which is that if you think about your annual physical exam, the core exam is largely a stethoscope, a reflex hammer, and a tongue depressor. If you're interested in knowing your family history, your doctor is, it's, hey, what did mom and dad have? Not much more sophisticated than that. And kind of integrating this all together historically has been the family practice physician or the internal medicine physician. Now, I can say what we're reducing to practice, and I think what the next generation of decision support and kind of care pathways for health and wellness is really a data-driven health assessment, your data. So when we're assessing your family history or your code, it's all 6 billion base pairs of your genome through whole genome sequencing. When we're assessing your core, it's whole body imaging biomarkers and blood biomarkers. And this 100 gigabytes of data growing to a terabyte can't possibly be integrated and made sense of by one physician. So enabling that physician, family practice, or internist is AI algorithms, predictive algorithms that will help enable decision support. So our Health Nucleus platform is largely 3 data silos. It's quantitative imaging biomarkers, it's rare and common variants from whole genome sequencing, it's blood biomarkers, and importantly, it's integrating all of that data with AI and putting it into a usable, both patient and physician-friendly reports that can be used to drive decision support. So I'll end with a couple slides. I started with the plot showing our decrease in longevity over the last 3 or 4 years. And this slide is somewhat cliche because I'm sure all of you have your different, if I asked you to kind of put together what your list would be, it might be very different from mine. So I just want to focus on the top 3, but these are really tenets for longevity and high performance. Sleep, this whole idea that we can get by with 6 or 7 hours of sleep is just garbage. All of us need close to 8 hours. There's very few people who genetically need less than 8 hours of sleep, so get sleep. And we argue that most of the other tenets on this list serve that one. So you exercise, you eat right, so you can get that 8 hours of sleep. If you get that 8 hours of sleep, you're strong. You have a much better chance of living to 100 and living to 100 healthily. Our mission for our patients and clients who come to see us is that you live over the age of 100, you live over the age of 100 healthily, and you die not of disease, but doing something you love. And I think largely, despite all of our investment, 17% of GDP, $3 trillion in the US healthcare system, if things were going so great, why is our life expectancy declining for the first time since World War I? If pills were the solution, our lifespan would be continuing to increase, and it's not. So I largely, if we think about most chronic age-related disease, most of us are not on the extremes of disease, right? I mean, how many, most disease is on a bell curve, right? So how many folks do you know that have super high blood pressure or super low blood pressure? That's a really low number. Most of us have maybe mildly elevated blood pressure. We have mildly elevated risk for hypertension or high blood pressure. Most of us don't need to be on a statin, an ACE inhibitor, a water pill, right? We can manage this with data with lifestyle changes. So program, not pills. I'll be the first one to say, as a physician practicing for the last 20 years, that of course for severe presentations, severe disease, there's absolutely a role for pharmacotherapy. But for most chronic age-related disease, program, not pills. But most importantly, know your numbers, because if you're doing everything right and you're getting your 8 hours of sleep and you're practicing yoga and you're eating kale and you just turned vegan, but you have a mutation for BRCA, and it's going to predispose you to deadly breast cancer in your 40s or deadly prostate cancer in your 40s, it doesn't matter what else you're doing if you have that mutation. So it turns out that measuring what matters and knowing your numbers is super important. And I'll end with this slide, which is that historically medicine has been a clinical science, sometimes supported by data, and I think we're moving towards a data science supported by clinicians. So happy to take any questions or speak to you after the talk.
Do we have time for one question? Behind you.
And thank you very much for the excellent talk. My question relates to human longevity. Sorry. I think we're all excited to live more than 100 years old, but what do you think will be the social and environmental implications if we extend lifespan of humans beyond 100? And also what the economic implications would be for the coming generations and the disparity in the world? Because people who can afford, the nations who can afford, they can be living longer versus the ones who are underprivileged.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, at the Milken conference every year, you know, there's this slide which shows actually state by state gross domestic product, and that goes up linearly with the healthy human lifespan. So, I mean, we can expect massive improvements in productivity and GDP with the increase of the healthy human lifespan, not the lifespan, but the healthy human lifespan. So look, I think having a discussion about kind of the social implications and, you know, who's going to pay for this if we're all living to 100, but maybe we're not working at 100, I think is probably a debate for another day. But it's super important, I think, to be thoughtful about those questions.
Great. I'll let me one quick
One
question.
more?
Yeah,
It's a quick question, like some of the risk factors that patient will be having is not modifiable. So you don't think so early detection of those that you cannot modify will create more anxiety, depression?
Yeah, you know, fortunately, most of the findings that we've had are sort of modifiable or actionable. So if you think about kind of the laundry list of findings that I rattled off, nearly in all cases, those are sort of actionable. So even finding a rare genetic mutation, almost in all cases, you know, if you know about that mutation in advance of the disease, there's actually a lot that you can do about it. So, you know, we find for most of our patients and clients that come through that actually getting these data is actually somewhat of a relief because they've you know, had this finding long before, you know, stage 3 or stage 4 disease.
Great. Dave,
Great.
thank you so much
Okay,
for that.
thank you.
Great.
Yeah.